create conversations that are often not openly spoken about on campus. One of the ways we are achieving this goal is through our newly launched YouTube talk show, Badger Vibe Check. This event, a necessary conversation with members of our community about an uncomfortable reality that exists on the UW-Madison campus. After reading the Badger Herald article, which has been made available to you all tonight, this event was created by the Wood SoPo team to further inform students about services available to them in the event of sexual assault on campus. This article was written by Leah Terry, who is here with us tonight. According to Leah's article, approximately 26% of female undergraduates at UW report experiencing sexual assault on the UW campus, and 11% have reported being raped. These numbers demonstrate just how present rape culture is at UW. Tonight, you will hear remarks from members of our community who are seeking to engage in an open and honest discourse about sexual violence at UW-Madison. This event is designed to be informational in nature and will feature 7 guest speaker presentations and a Q&A session. We will also have a short 5-minute break about halfway through the program. It's my pleasure to now introduce our first set of speakers for the evening, and please note this is a change from the scheduled program. Allow me to advance in my papers here. Please welcome the Safewalk Delegation to the stage.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So we are both from UW Campus Safewalk. So if you see people wearing neon orange with Safewalk on the back, that's us. So we are a student-run organization here on campus that can walk anybody on campus home, not just students. At night, we are often posted in the library and places around campus. So if you see us, feel free to come up to us. This is a free service that we provide to everybody here on campus.
Hours of service are 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. October through March, and then 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. April to September. To schedule a walk, you can call or text the number at 608-262-5000. One more time, that's 608-262-5000.
And we do have boundaries where we can walk people home. It's about around the Capitol to further on Lakeshore. So we have a wide range of territory that we cover each night. And we're gonna hand around these little pamphlets with our number and some more information on how to call in a walk. You can also request scheduled walks. Some people do that. If you know you're gonna be studying late or something, you can call in advance, leave us a message and schedule a walk for a certain night. Thank you.
Thank you to Safewalk for joining us tonight. And now we will move forward with introducing our first official speaker of the evening, Dr. Kate Walsh. Sorry, my pages are out of order. I didn't do it, except I kind of did, sorry. Okay, lovely. Wonderful. So Dr. Kate Walsh is a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor in the Psychology and Gender and Women's Studies departments at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is the head of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, an interdisciplinary cross-campus collaboration between students and faculty in various disciplines, including sociology, social work, human ecology, public affairs, political science, and more. She is also the director of the Preventing Interpersonal Violence and Overcoming Trauma, or PIVOT Lab, and is a collaborator with the Culture of Respect initiative organized by the Violence Prevention Team here at UW-Madison. Dr. Walsh received her bachelor's degree from Boston University and her master's and PhD from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship in traumatic stress and substance use epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health in Columbia University and was an assistant professor at Furkhoff Graduate School of Psychology at Yeshiva University in New York City before joining the faculty at UW-Madison as a tenured associate professor in August 2020. Prior to joining the faculty here, she was a co-investigator on Columbia University's Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, SHIFT study. She has published more than 80 peer-reviewed manuscripts and 7 books chapters focused on the prevention of or response to sexual and relationship violence in a variety of samples, including adolescents and adults, treatment-seeking samples, military and veteran samples, incarcerated samples, and college student samples. Her work has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute on Drug Abuse. She is also the recent recipient of a grant from the Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime to expand access to services, including forensic nurse exams and advocacy for students on the UW-Madison campus. At this time, please help me welcome to the stage our evening's keynote speaker, Dr. Kate Walsh.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I'd like to start with a few acknowledgements. I'd first like to start with a content warning. This presentation will cover some difficult topics, and I want to encourage everyone in the room to please take care of yourself. Feel free to step out, disengage, get in touch if there are advocates in the room with one of the advocates, and do anything else you might need to do to take care of yourself tonight. I also wanted to provide a context acknowledgement that I borrowed with permission from Molly Zemke in violence prevention. And this is very similar to the land acknowledgement that you just heard, but it really helps to ground us a little bit in the work that we're doing around prevention and response to sexual violence. So preventing harm and supporting survivors starts with truth telling. We're living in working and learning on stolen Ho-Chunk land and in an institution with a long history and current realities of colonialism, racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and other oppressions. These same oppressions are at the root of sexual and relationship violence. We honor the resilience of this land and the legacy and ongoing efforts of its Ho-Chunk people, all BIPOC, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA+, disabled, and other survivors and activists who have laid the foundation for this work and for a future of healing and collective liberation. And with that, I'd also like to acknowledge my background and talk a bit about my research program. So I'm keeping the context acknowledgement in mind. I'm clearly a white woman, I am cisgender, and so I want to acknowledge that I have a lot of privilege in the work that I do and in my position on campus, and that's always something that I try to keep in mind and in check as I'm doing this work. So briefly, my research program covers three primary areas. The first is focused on the prevalence and risk factors for sexual violence, and I look both at perpetration and at victimization. And I've studied a lot of different samples, as Micah said in the introduction. So I've looked at military and veteran personnel. I've also done research on adolescents, adults, treatment-seeking populations, incarcerated populations, and of course, college student populations. I'm also very interested in better understanding the ecology in which assaults are occurring so we can be thoughtful about the kinds of prevention work that we might be doing. The second area is focused on thinking about outcomes that are common among those who've experienced sexual violence. And so I, as a clinical psychologist, study mental health outcomes, things like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, substance use disorders, suicidality. And then I'm also very interested in trying to understand mechanisms that can help us explain these. And so things like emotion dysregulation. And then much of my work has also focused on behavioral outcomes. So things like experiencing repeated victimization over the life course. And then lastly, my research aims to think about how we can translate some of these first two areas into effective prevention and intervention programming. And so I've done work around the primary prevention of perpetration, but I've also done some work around the secondary prevention of psychopathology, including mental health and substance use symptoms and re-victimization among people who've experienced violence. And then lastly, I'll be touching on this today. I've also been doing some work to expand response options for survivors, particularly on our campus. So my plan for tonight is to talk a bit about the scope of sexual violence, particularly on our campus. I'm then going to speak briefly about the state of the prevention literature. I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges with prevention work as I see them. I will also be speaking a bit about some of the UW specific data on sexual assault and in particular awareness of services on our campus. I'll be speaking a bit about my Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime grant and mentioning a few additional research goals. And then finally, I'll end by elevating some survivor voices and reiterating some student group recommendations. So many folks in the audience are probably familiar with issues of sexual violence. There have been, large media campaigns and other things that have made national headlines and news, including the Me Too movement that has been ongoing for the last several years. Additionally, at the same time, we've also been seeing a focus on campus assault at the national level. And when I talk about sexual violence and assault, I'm referring to unwanted sexual contact as well as oral, anal, or vaginal penetration when someone is incapacitated or when force is used or when coercion is being used. On college campuses, we see that about 20 to 25% of college women and about 7 to 12% of college men will experience some form of sexual assault during their college tenure. And then we also see that rates are elevated among students of color, LGBTQ+ students, and disabled students. Sexual violence is associated with a range of negative sequelae, including long-term physical health problems, mental health concerns, and interpersonal difficulties. Additionally, it's associated with significant economic costs. In a 2014 study examining the costs of rape, when police and victim advocate services, medical and mental health services were factored in, each individual survivor of rape cost the US government about $122,000. And multiplying that by the number of survivors, we see that there's a population economic burden of nearly $3.1 trillion in 2014 US dollars over the course of survivors' lifetime. So not that I need to put this into like financial terms for people to care about, but I do think it's important to know how costly this issue is. So a number of different models have been offered for trying to understand risk factors for sexual violence and other forms of violence that may co-occur. And Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological model, I think, really speaks to me and has been adapted for the purposes of better understanding sexual violence risk. So this model posits that there are different levels of the social ecology at which different risk factors may play an important role. So at the individual level, things like one's personal demographics or maybe having a history of childhood maltreatment may signify disproportionate vulnerability to experiencing sexual violence. At the next level, thinking about interpersonal dynamics, relationships, peer norms around alcohol use and sexual behavior, dating, et cetera, can all play a role. Social support can be protective in this relationship as well. At the next level, so thinking about kind of concentric circles that broaden out, thinking about the broader community, factors like community attitudes towards sexual assault and sexual health, access to comprehensive sex education, and even campus resources for survivors can be a really important thing to think about in the college context. And then at the final level, we might see things like economic or social policies, the societal acceptance of violence against women, trans people, and children, and police and judicial system actions, all kind of playing a role in signifying to survivors how the general public feels about violence. The CDC has recommended that when we create prevention programming, we really need to be thinking about doing this at multiple levels of this social ecology. So instead of developing programs that just target one single level, we need to be thoughtful about creating multi-tiered programming. So one example might be using traditional bystander interventions to target the community level, and I'll talk a little bit more about what those are in a moment. And then maybe coupling it with like a self-defense program at the individual level, like Chimera will be describing. So now I want to speak briefly and kind of ground us in the state of the current prevention literature. So I think one thing that's really important to note is that we have started systematically studying sexual violence, and this is the case. We've been studying it pretty systematically since the 1980s. And despite a proliferation of prevention programs, we've seen rates of sexual violence remain really stable for the last 4 decades. And I think that's important to acknowledge. It's not that we're not doing research and we're not developing prevention programs, however. And so the CDC also put out a paper where they evaluated prevention programs. And so this was an evaluation of 140 different studies that had done some kind of prevention related to sexual or relationship violence. Only 82 were randomized controlled trials. Of those 82, only 63 followed folks beyond the post-test period to actually be able to measure behaviors and whether it made an impact in people's people's lives. And then of those 63, only 17 actually measured sexual violence, either perpetration or victimization. And then of those 17, only 3 were found to have significant effects, and none of those 3 were at the college or post-secondary level. So 2 were at the high school level, and then 1 was at that broader socio-ecological level, looking at policies, and found that the Violence Against Women Act funding was one of the 3 prevention programs that showed effectiveness. And so I think this is important to keep in mind. Like, this is an area where we've been doing a lot of work, and we are still needing to put in more effort and try to think about ways that we can shift these dynamics. Okay, so I want to speak briefly about some of the challenges as I see them with some of the perpetration prevention work that we're trying to do. So one issue is that campuses generally, so not us alone, campuses generally are not systematically collecting data on sexual assault perpetration. We know from some studies that have focused on college men that if you look at their lifetime rates of perpetration, about 1 in 3 will report some act that meets a behaviorally specific definition for sexual assault perpetration, and far fewer will report anything that meets criteria for perpetrating rape, so only about 6.5. However, there really have not been many studies focused on understanding the prevalence of perpetration during the college period specifically. So you may have heard earlier, we were talking about prevalence of sexual violence victimization, and there's usually people will say, well, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 women will experience victimization. There's not a comparable estimate for perpetration. And I think that stymies perpetration efforts because we really don't understand the scope of the issue. Additionally, in recent years, we've been seeing some social desirability concerns, particularly with some of the large media movements like Me Too, that have really been impacting the types of estimates that we are getting on measures. And so measures that we used to get 1 in 3 people reporting, we're now seeing somewhere in like the 10% range we're reporting. And so I think that this is a challenge for researchers to contend with, and I'm happy to speak after this about some of the things we've tried. However, I do want to speak very briefly about some recent data that my graduate student Stephanie Ward and I collected from UW-Madison men here on campus, and I'll be speaking in a little bit about why we're focusing on men. The short answer is that the 98.7% of the assaults that happened on our campus were perpetrated by men, but I also want to be clear that men are not the only perpetrators, and other folks can also engage in these behaviors. So for this particular study, we were really interested in the intersection between drinking and sexual behaviors. And so Rianda Washington conducted a study a few years ago on our campus, I think in 2018, finding strong relationships between drinking, heavy drinking, and lots of risk behaviors. And so we were really interested for this study in following up on that work and thinking about alcohol-induced blackouts in particular. We were anticipating that about 20% of our students would report a past month blackout. We recruited from fraternities and from the general population. And actually we found that nearly 2/3 reported a past month blackout, which was a bit alarming for us. And then we also looked at rates of perpetration, victimization experiences, which were also quite high, and then memory impaired sexual experiences. And so these might have been experiences that people had while they were using drugs or alcohol that maybe they didn't recall, or they couldn't recall completely. Maybe someone had to ask them the next day, did we have sex last night, and that kind of thing, and found some significant associations between blacking out and those kinds of experiences over long periods of time. We also found that fraternity membership and of course heavy drinking were associated with blackouts even after we accounted for demographics. And so this is just the beginning of trying to better understand kind of the social ecology of what might be happening on our campus. We're planning to follow this up, and I'll be speaking about that a little bit more later. But I do think that it really highlights a significant issue with like alcohol and other kinds of behaviors that are sexual in nature. So the second challenge, as I see it, is that the risk landscape may vary across campuses. And this is particularly important in light of the first challenge, because if we're not systematically collecting data on perpetration across campuses, we tend to be relying on what other campuses are finding. And in fact, in a recent review that I completed with colleagues, we reviewed 43 studies that looked just at campus level characteristics associated with a wide variety of different forms of victimization. We found that campuses really do vary in their rates and in their characteristics, and those characteristics matter. And so we can't easily just pull data from one campus and apply it to our own. We really do need to be doing the work to match our prevention efforts to our campus characteristics. A third concern, and I'll be speaking a little bit about bystander intervention to kind of help explicate this, is that a lot of campuses across the country are moving towards doing kind of one size fits all prevention programming. And right now, you know, that's what we've got and that's what we're working with. But some of the recent data that we've collected suggests that this approach may not be sufficient. I think it's a very helpful baseline, but it might not be sufficient for actually preventing perpetration. So I participated, as Micah alluded to, in as an investigator in the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation study at Columbia. And this was a study where we recruited a random sample of undergraduate students, and we had about 349 students in that sample who'd experienced some form of sexual assault on campus and provided us with some detailed information about the assault experience. And we tried to use that socio-ecological model to try to better understand the characteristics of the assault as they were occurring. And so at the innermost level, instead of looking at individual characteristics, we looked at incident characteristics. So things like what kind of assault happened? Was it sexual touching? Was it attempted? Was it completed? And then what tactics were used during the assault? At the next level, we were thinking about relationship variables. So how do you know the person? What is their relationship to you? And then at the broadest level, we were thinking about socio-contextual variables, like where did you meet the person? Where were you right before the assault happened? Were you drinking? Were they drinking? Those sorts of things. We put these all into a model that essentially provided us with data on different groupings that we could observe across the data. And so what we ended up seeing was that we had about 3 different assault types or classes that emerged from these data. The largest group is in the blue, so about 47%, and they were characterized as our incapacitation, known assailant, and both drinking class. And so this means that we were seeing assaults in this class that where people knew each other, they were likely to be friends or acquaintances. It often was happening at a party. There were other people around beforehand, which is a key for being able to engage in bystander intervention. And both parties were typically drinking. Our next most prevalent class was the verbal coercion, partner, friend, or private class. And for this one, we saw that people were not drinking in these instances. They were most often likely to happen with a partner or an ex-partner. They were often not happening when another person was around who could intervene. And so I think that's really important to think about. And this group was also the least likely to disclose their experiences to anyone. And then our least prevalent, but still important, they were about 20% of the assaults classes, were the unwanted sexual touching, stranger, and public. And so this was typically people going to a party or a bar and someone touching them or grabbing them without their consent. Folks were often drinking, but there were other people around who could potentially intervene. So why is this important? I think for a number of reasons. So bystander interventions are kind of the typical approach that most campuses are using right now to do prevention work. And they train students to feel like members of a community who can play an important role in preventing sexual assault. One of the really nice things about bystander interventions is that they can provide education to a large group of people in a way where the students might not necessarily get defensive. They can feel like, oh, great, I can be a part of the solution instead of a part of the problem. And so I think it's a really great way of getting information across. However, and I will say before I go into the however, it is associated with some real positive changes. So increases in knowledge, increases in people's efficacy to intervene, increases in their intentions to intervene, and then actual intervention behavior. So those are all great. However, it is not associated with reductions in actual rates of perpetration. And so what I was saying before about I don't think these are sufficient for preventing perpetration is that I think these are a great baseline, but we need to add some additional materials to actually be preventing perpetration from occurring. And my other concern is that for the VCPP class that I talked about before, where it was like verbal coercion, a partner, private, and there weren't other people around, there may not be people to intervene in those instances. And then lastly, there are some data that suggest that intoxicated bystanders, so thinking about like the mutually intoxicated other groups, are not always the best at intervening. And so there could be various points in this model on the left-hand side here where an intoxicated bystander may have difficulty actually being able to intervene. So the model is such that there has to be an emergency. Someone needs to notice that something's happening, then they have to interpret the event as an emergency. They need to take responsibility for providing help. They need to decide how to help, and then they actually need to provide help. And so at any point in that process, an intoxicated person might have some difficulty. So I think it's really important that we think about what it means for our heavy drinking campus if we're working with bystander interventions. And then the last challenge that I'll mention is that I think a lot of the work that has been done from a research perspective, so not like a boots on the ground perspective, but a research perspective, has really avoided or overlooked attending to intersectionality. And so there was a paper by Sarah Brubaker in 2017 that pointed out how much privilege and exclusion there is in a lot of the published research on what we know and what we do. And so the experiences of white, heterosexual, cisgender, middle class, non-disabled, and American citizens who are students at primarily elite traditional colleges and universities are typically taken as the norm, and the experiences of students of color, LGBTQ+ students, disabled students, and international students often are neglected, at least in the research literature. So I want to shift gears briefly and talk about some survivor support efforts, in particular, some of the work that we've been doing on campus to expand response options. So Micah alluded to this earlier, but the Association of American Universities data has provided us with some understanding of how sexual violence looks on our campus. The University of Wisconsin-Madison participated in 2 waves of data collection. The first happened in 2015, the second in 2019. On the left-hand side, you're seeing the average for all of the campuses who participated in each of those waves. And the blue represents the percentage of undergraduate women who experienced any unwanted sexual contact during their time on campus. On the right-hand side are the UW-Madison specific numbers. And so you can see in 2015, we were about 5 percentage points above the average. And in 2019, we're right at average, but essentially about 1 in 4 women on our campus are experiencing unwanted sexual contact. I was also interested in learning from this survey who is most likely to experience sexual violence. And this graph here shows the gender breakdown. And you can see that women, trans, genderqueer, and non-binary students are significantly more likely than men to experience sexual violence victimization. However, men are not experiencing this at non-negligible rates, and we need to be really thoughtful about making sure that we're not gearing programming and other sorts of things just towards women, trans, and non-binary folks. Sexual orientation also showed significant associations. So those who identify as bisexual or other had significantly higher rates of sexual violence victimization compared to those who identify as lesbian or gay or heterosexual. And students who identify as having a disability were twice as likely as students who did not to experience sexual violence victimization, according to this survey. Additionally, we looked at race and ethnicity. The data here on the left-hand side show the breakdown of those who experience sexual violence when thinking about the overall sample, including undergraduate and graduate students, and then all genders. But I don't think it tells the full story, and this is an example of where intersectionality is really, really important to consider. And so on the right-hand side, these are the data for undergraduate women, and you can see that there are much more elevated rates. So about 31% of undergraduate women who identify as Hispanic or Latinx are reporting some form of sexual assault victimization. And then multiracial students and Black women are also experiencing high rates. So who are the perpetrators? I mentioned before that we're not collecting great data, and we're not alone in this. Most campuses are not collecting great data on perpetration. And so what we do know is basically from our victimization surveys, and I don't think one should replace the other. But from these surveys, what we're seeing is that about 98.7% of the people who experienced victimization reported that their perpetrator was male. And then on the other side, most people, so about 77% were reporting that the perpetrator was a student. This graph shows the location of the assault and then whether alcohol use by the perpetrator or by the survivor occurred. And so you can see that there are a lot of different spaces where students might experience victimization. So I think fraternity houses are in orange. The gray is other housing. Dorms are in purple. And then other is blue, and bars and nightclubs are in yellow. And so there really is kind of a wide range of different spaces. And then more than a quarter indicated that the survivor was drinking before the assault occurred, and slightly less than a quarter indicated that the perpetrator was drinking before the assault occurred. So I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about what we know about survivor awareness and campus awareness more broadly of resources. And so this graph here shows UW-specific and Madison-specific resources that students could know about. And so the good news is that students really know about university health services, medical and mental health. They also seem to know about police, and a good percentage of students knew about the Rape Crisis Center in our community. The not so great news is that fewer than a half of students knew about the Title IX office, which is now called the Sexual Misconduct Resource and Response Office, so about 43.5%. A similar percentage knew about the University Health Services Survivor Services resources, and that's where survivors can go to get connected to advocacy, medical and mental health services. And then fewer than a third of students knew about the Meritor Forensic Nurse Examiner program in our community. And we have Ali Schlotz, who's going to be speaking about that later today. But essentially, FNE programs provide wonderful resources for survivors. They can treat injuries, provide emotional support, collect evidence, do STI, HIV, and other forms of screening, and just a really comprehensive service. So it's a shame that students weren't as aware. While I was preparing the grant that I'm going to be talking about, I also got in touch with Meritor to ask them a little bit about our student utilization of services. And they reported that only about 7% of the patients that they see annually are UW-Madison students, and they didn't observe changes in utilization when school was in session versus when it wasn't. So suggesting that people have low awareness and they're also maybe not using this resource as much as they could be. Additionally, for those who experienced violence, the survey asked about accessing any resource, and we saw that about 30% of students who reported some penetrative sexual violence on campus had accessed any resource. Among those who did not access a resource, there were some follow-up questions, and slightly less than half of those who didn't access a resource said that they didn't do it because they didn't think it was serious enough. And then upon following up even more, we saw that about 70% didn't think it was serious enough because they weren't injured or hurt. Slightly less than 50% said that it started out consensually, and slightly more than 50% said that it involved alcohol or drugs. This is concerning for me. I have done some work in other samples looking at types of sexual violence and what it means for service seeking. And so in a nationally representative sample, I found that women who'd experienced a drug or alcohol facilitated rape were significantly less likely than women who'd experienced a forcible rape to seek services, in part because they didn't identify what happened to them as an assault, but they had similar levels of concerns to those who'd experienced a forcible rape in terms of pregnancy, HIV, STI, and a lot of things that we can actually treat and screen for at the hospital. So that leads me into talking about the Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime grant that was awarded last October. So I worked very collaboratively with folks in violence prevention, survivor services, and then also spoke a good deal to people who are providing these services out in our community to get a sense of what's available to students, how are they getting connected, et cetera. I saw this grant call before I even got to campus and thought, that looks perfect. This call was designed to expand access to forensic medical exams and to also expand advocacy for campus sexual assault survivors. It's only $500,000 over 3 years, but I think we've been able to do a lot of great stuff with it so far. And so I'm really excited about this work. So I've been partnering, as I mentioned before, with violence prevention and survivor services, and then some of our community partners as well. And we used a lot of the AAU data that I just described to identify some areas for improvement. And then I also spoke with some students about what's the experience like of trying to find services on campus. So the first goal here is to better understand barriers to resource utilization, both on and off campus. The AAU data gave us some good ideas about why students might not access any service, but they didn't give us a lot of great detail about why they may not access specific services. And so I've been conducting some qualitative interviews, particularly with students who may be disproportionately at risk for experiencing sexual and relationship violence, to better understand barriers to accessing resources. So this includes reasons for not seeking services, and also awareness of services more generally, how students get connected from one resource to another, and then how they're learning about services. So are they using the internet? Are they talking to friends, et cetera? A second aim that will be followed up in the fall to get a sense of how our current advocacy services are working will be to survey students who've used those advocacy services so we can identify and address any gaps that we might notice. So I want to speak briefly about the paid student interviews that I've been doing to date. So I'm planning to conduct 30 interviews total. So far, I've conducted 24 as of last week. 6 have been with graduate students and 18 with undergraduate students. And we've had a lot of diversity in the background and experiences of folks who've agreed to participate. So students are asked about barriers and facilitators to accessing resources, ways to make services more inclusive, and how they would search for information on our website. And so far, what we're seeing is that students without assault experiences generally seem to perceive that the resources on campus are adequate. They have mentioned that they'd like to have some more regular training on resources so that they can better understand what's available to them. And a few students have mentioned, one time a year would be really helpful. And so I don't know if we need to repeat the whole training or if just the segment on like resources would be helpful, but we're thinking about that with violence prevention right now. Students who've had assault experiences, whether it's sexual or relationship violence, have generally had different impressions. I will say some students have been, happy with the services that they're receiving, but some students have said that it's really difficult to get connected to services, and it feels like there are these really big systems that they're trying to navigate, and they'd like more support in being able to navigate those systems. And so this made a lot of sense. And then I also want to mention that students have made some really great recommendations to expand services. So some of our existing services, things like Safewalk, students have made some suggestions for how do we expand the timing or the spaces where folks can go. And I know that that might not be entirely possible, but maybe, bringing back things like Safe Ride, that was also mentioned. Additionally, there have been some requests to increase mental health and survivor services staff. And then students have also made some great suggestions about how to improve our website so we can improve our language so it's warmer and feels like there are people on the other end. And then maybe also, provide some information about if I call this number, what am I going to get on the other end of that? And how's this person going to respond to me? So our second goal has been to expand campus advocacy and lay the foundation for a sexual assault response team, or a SART. And so for the first part of this goal, I planned to hire a campus advocate to augment our existing advocacy services that were offered within UHS Survivor Services. We had a model where the advocates were also the folks who were providing counseling, and so the ability to be able to do both was a bit more limited. And so we now have a full-time advocate, and then we have 2 folks from violence prevention who are half-time and who are supporting the full-time advocate. And so we've been able to do an amazing, I think it's just been an incredible change for our campus. So Anna Gorman started in July, and then Violence Prevention's Molly Zemke and China Lewis are supporting the position, and Molly's going to be speaking in a little bit more about that. A second goal was to lay the foundation for this SART. So a SART is this really beautiful model where you essentially get all the people who are serving survivors in some capacity into a room together so that they know who each other are. They can talk about challenges that they might be experiencing and trying to provide services, and troubleshoot those difficulties and kind of really make the provision of services a lot more seamless and a lot less burden on individual students to try to seek out what they need. And so right now, Jessica Melnick, who is the chair of PAVE, and I are starting to collect some information from stakeholders to inform the composition and function of this SART. Our third goal was to strengthen relationships between university health services and community resources and offer more students more opportunities to receive forensic medical exams. And so the first area that we focused on was working with Meritor to kind of better understand how they were seeking, how students were seeking services there and what some of the barriers to seeking services might be. And so Meritor's been very involved with some of the work that we're doing right now to increase awareness of their services. And you're going to hear a little bit later from them. The second place where we've been trying to do some work is with the Rape Crisis Center. So they currently have an advocate who spends time on our campus. And so we're really trying to think about ways that we can expand their involvement and enrich that partnership. And then lastly, I was able to establish a partnership with the Dane Multi-Agency Center, a relatively new nonprofit in Madison. Kim Curran is the head, and her co-head, Rachel Sattler, is a lawyer. Kim is a forensic nurse. And essentially what they're doing is providing like one-stop shopping, if you will, for survivors of violence. And so for our campus in particular, they are providing forensic nurses who can come and provide FNEs at UHS. So students never have to leave campus. They don't have to go out of the UHS system. They don't have to be in an emergency department, and they can get that care on campus. Now it is during business hours. We don't have the capacity to serve folks overnight or on weekends. And so it's really important that we maintain the Meritor connection as well. But I think this is a really nice additional option for students. And so far, we started seeing patients in July, and as of the end of November, we'd had 33 student schedule appointments, and thanks to Jane Vandermeer for putting this slide together. And we had 16 students schedule appointments during that same time window in the 2019 year, so before COVID. So that's more than double who were scheduling. Of the 33, 16 were seen by the mobile FNE, and all of the patients said that they would not have gone off campus to the hospital to get those services. So we were able to serve 16 folks who otherwise would not have gotten that service, which I think is amazing. And then down at the bottom, we have some testimonials from students who've used these services about how helpful they've been. And then our fourth goal was to improve knowledge and awareness of the resources available to survivors and clarify some misconceptions about eligibility for services that I mentioned before. So things like it started out consensually, or we were both drinking. I mean, those are still assaults, and folks are eligible to get services, and we want to help them. So the first area of this goal has been focused on website revisions. So I mentioned earlier that the second half of my interview was about how students are searching for information. Do they talk to friends? Are they using the internet? And what I'm doing is actually having them walk me through, like, if a friend disclosed to you and you didn't know how to find services, like, what search terms do you type in? Like, do you go to our website or Google? What are you seeing? Like, what are you expecting to see? And having them kind of walk me through what would be helpful for us to change. And students have just had amazing suggestions. We've also been working closely with Culture of Respect, and in particular, Molly Zemke in Violence Prevention, to start thinking about how we can streamline some of our web pages and just make it easier to navigate in general. The second area is a media campaign. And so we've been spending all semester doing some planning for this media campaign that we're hoping to launch in the spring, or we will launch in the spring. And it's been really, really, I think, a very enriching experience, because we've had participation from folks from all across campus, which has been amazing through the Culture of Respect initiative. We've also gotten participation from folks in our community. So Meritor has been heavily involved, and so has the Rape Crisis Center. And I'm really excited about the work that we're going to put out and just making students more aware of our services. And then lastly, we've been talking a bit about trying to augment some of our trainings to include some additional information about how students can get access to resources, and we may come up with something where we can provide this a little bit more frequently to students as they requested. So I want to close out the research part of things by talking a little bit about some existing gaps that I mentioned earlier and some short-term research goals. So I mentioned that I think it's really important that we collect some perpetration data. My graduate student and I have already started to do a little bit of that, but we're really hoping to expand on that. And so we are currently planning a study where we will collect some daily diary data from, we'll start with college men, but really to get a sense of like how alcohol and sexual experiences are interacting like in real time. So we know like what are the proximal predictors of sexual aggression. And of course, as I mentioned before, men are not the only perpetrators. And so we are also planning to adapt our language and make sure that our methods are appropriate, but give to folks of other genders as well. Additionally, I think it's really important that we collect some nuanced data from survivors on service needs. And so I have an IRB under review right now so that we can collect data from a random sample of students, ask about sexual violence experiences, and then also get some information about whether they sought services, what those experiences were like, or why they might not have sought services. And so we're using some of what we're learning in the qualitative interviews to really shape what we'll be asking in that survey. I'm also hoping in that survey to replicate some of the classes that I talked about earlier, or maybe find some UW specific classes. So we'll see how that goes. And then lastly, I think it's really critical that we think about developing and testing some UW specific interventions. So I think some identity and needs-based prevention and intervention programs would be amazing. And I know violence prevention is already working on a lot of this stuff, so hoping to partner with violence prevention. And then I think we also need to be thinking about how sexual violence intersects with other forms of oppression. And lastly, I'm very interested, given the high rates of alcohol use on our campus and sexual behavior and alcohol use, to be thinking about how we can do more intervention around consent and alcohol use and go beyond just education and really give students an opportunity to practice some of the skills that maybe they've never gotten a chance to practice before. How do you have these like very difficult conversations with folks? All right, I'm gonna skip that. All right, so I want to elevate some survivor and student voices. I'm going to start with the student voices. So back in October, and I think Paige and Endamazia and Talia are probably going to reiterate this as well. But back in October, we had a great roundtable event, and the students made some suggestions for ways that our campus could think about moving forward and supporting survivors. And so some of the suggestions were things like expanding advocacy services, so thinking about broadening hours, appointing and hiring a strategic planner who could address sexual violence, providing some tech support perhaps for a chat feature on the Survivor Services website to help kind of walk people through things. So we're envisioning something like when you go to the library website and a little chat pops up and somebody's like, what can I help you with? Just being able to like help people navigate better. Getting some support for additional surveys and feedback from students, and then hiring some more Title IX investigators or sexual misconduct resource and response investigators. My understanding is that that has just happened. So some of these things are already coming to fruition, which is great. And I'll add one more. I think this has also come to light, and PAVE is circulating a petition right now, but we could use some more staff in survivor services. And I think the administration is very aware of this and is working hard to make sure that that happens. Okay, and then lastly, I just wanted to celebrate the incredible resiliency of survivors on our campus. PAVE had put out an anonymous survey for students earlier this fall and asked a variety of different questions. There were a few that I was going to highlight before, but I realize I'm very much over time. So I want to highlight the resiliency. These are direct quotes from students. I'll just read the very last one. You deserve better, the best actually. And these are all affirmations from survivors to other survivors on our campus. So you deserve better, the best actually. The fact that you are here breathing means that you've survived, and that takes an extraordinary amount of strength, wisdom, and grace. You will carry these same characteristics forward into a tomorrow that is better than today. And I just thought that was a really beautiful, and so many of these are beautiful. There were more than 50 of them. I selected just a few. So thank you to survivors for this motivational speaking. So lastly, I'd like to thank everyone who participated in my interviews and in other research. Like, thank you so much. I'd also like to thank my lab members, in particular, Jessica Melnick, who is also the chair of PAVE.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walsh. That was an incredibly insightful presentation. I know I definitely learned a lot that I did not previously know. Our second speaker of the night is going to be Molly Zemke from UW-Madison UHS. Molly oversees the Violence Prevention and Survivor Services Advocacy programs at UHS and leads UW-Madison's participation in the Culture of Respect Collective. Molly started at UHS in 2013 as a UW graduate student while in the Master of Public Health program, and supported program evaluation and educational efforts with graduate and professional students prior to becoming the manager in 2018. Please join me in welcoming Molly Zemke.
Sorry.
Good evening, everyone. Molly Zemke, she, her, hers pronouns. Really glad to be here with you all today. I just also want to recognize I am here. I'm going to be talking mostly about our services at UHS for survivor services. You heard a little bit about that from Dr. Walsh, but I want to recognize that I am representing a really large team. I think there are some folks here from survivor services. So I just want to acknowledge that I am representing a really large team of folks that are doing incredible work in advocacy, mental health, and medical services to support survivors. Before I talk again more specifically about our services at UHS survivor services, because we've made some really great shifts to hopefully better serve the needs of student survivors on our campus. And part of that was made possible by the grant that Dr. Walsh spoke about. I do want to plug our violence prevention team and efforts as well, because we're doing really important work on campus too. This is the violence prevention team here, and we are trying to work really across the social ecology that you heard Dr. Walsh talk about. We do that through building the capacity of our campus community to prevent violence, support survivors, and shift the culture. We do this in large part through delivering those educational skill building programs. A lot of those are for our new and incoming students. We also do a lot of training and capacity building with staff, faculty, and student groups. We do a lot of that through our Bystander Intervention program called ActWise. And we also try to convene, support collaborations, partnerships, in part through the Culture of Respect initiative that you've heard a little bit about tonight as well. So again, I'm here mostly to talk about UHS survivor services, which these services have existed for quite a bit of time at UHS. And again, some really incredible folks behind this team, but I do want to really highlight the work that's happened this fall semester to create a more integrated, coordinated approach to survivor care and support. So we offer at UHS confidential advocacy, mental health, and medical services for students who've experienced sexual and relationship violence. Before I talk more specifically about some of the services that we provide at UHS, I do want to really underscore that this is for students who experience a range of forms of interpersonal violence. So this can include sexual assault, sexual harassment, dating and domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and stalking. And it's really across the lifespan. So this is not limited to students who've experienced violence since they came to campus. This can be prior to coming to campus as well. So as I've mentioned, and you've heard referenced, survivor services is really a more comprehensive approach to survivor support and care by providing advocacy, mental health, and medical services. And I'm going to talk about each of those a little bit more in depth. So advocacy, and as Dr. Walsh mentioned, this has been provided through UHS for several years and has been primarily provided through our mental health providers prior to the fall semester. And with the availability of the grant and the opportunity to be able to hire a full-time advocate, we've been able to expand the advocacy services. Okay, so just to kind of focus for folks about what advocates do, how is that maybe distinct from like our mental health services, our medical services, and really important kind of philosophically or foundationally, we're really using a self-determined and empowerment approach. So really meeting students with where they're at. So students can come into our advocacy program and really kind of let us know how we can best support them. And so we're really going to take their lead about how they want to respond. We're going to provide information about options and resources on campus and in the community, options for reporting, options for seeking additional services. We're also going to try to support immediate needs. And so a lot of times we might have students who have just some basic needs, concerns related to their academics, concerns related to financial resources. We're really able to support students or try to make connections and get resources for them based on their kind of more immediate needs as a result of the experience of violence. We also provide validation and emotional support. And so for a lot of students, this may be the first, individuals who they're sharing their experience with, maybe outside of friends or family. And so it's really important that we're kind of sitting with that, we're providing space for them to talk through their experience. We also provide assistance with navigating systems. And this can be, again, with really taking the lead from the student about the approaches that they want to take. If they would like to report to campus, they would like to report to law enforcement, we can really help them understand those systems a little bit more and what they can expect. So with that, thinking about the specific services that we provide at UHS Survivor Services Advocacy, we can support students with accessing accommodations. As I mentioned, students may be coming in with some concerns about, academically, how am I going to participate as a student now that I've experienced this assault or a previous assault is impacting, or experience of intimate partner violence, for example, is impacting their ability to participate as a student. So we can assist them with thinking through or reaching out to instructors, if this is impacting their workplace, if this is impacting their housing environment, we can support them in reaching out to those folks to see if they can provide some support to students as they're going through this. We also provide, as I mentioned, information about victims' rights, brief intervention. We can support students around coping skills, thinking about safety planning. Again, some of those more kind of immediate needs, thinking about how they're gonna talk to their friends and family about experiences of violence. We can really support them in thinking through that. Accompaniments, so we can provide accompany students to related appointments. So if they're reporting to campus, reporting to law enforcement, having a conversation with an instructor, if they would like us to come along as a support person, we're available for that as well. Resources and referrals, we try to be really aware of all the resources, as you'll hear about tonight, the variety of resources on campus and in the community, and try to provide those resources for students. And then consultations, and this can really be for not just survivors, but friends, family, instructors who may be supporting students. We can provide some support and how they can best support the student. So important to share how y'all can reach out to advocacy services. So we have our general email address, survivorservices@uhs.wis.edu. We have our general line, the UHS phone number 265-5600. And if you select option 3, you're able to get connected with an advocate. And we are also available to schedule through Starfish. If students are familiar with how to schedule via Starfish, maybe familiar with a way that you connect maybe with your advisors, you're able to see our open appointments and self-schedule there as well. And so we are available for in-person and virtual appointments. And we're still offering appointments for the fall semester. And then we'll be back again in the spring semester offering those appointments. And we're located at 333 East Campus Mall on the 8th floor. We're not currently offering drop-in services, but we, again, are able to schedule with students pretty quickly via our Starfish app. And then really important to recognize that there are the 24-hour helplines because we are providing those advocacy services during regular business hours. And so for students who maybe need that support outside of that time, I really encourage students to connect with the 24-hour helplines from RCC and DAYS. All right, so mental health services at UHS. Again, there are trauma-specific services provided by a great group of counselors at UHS. And really this slide just kind of underscores what we hope any person, any counselor would be providing to survivors. But again, are some really specialty services and care approaches that we're able to provide at UHS through our mental health services. So that's really thinking about meeting students where they're at. A lot of the same approaches that we were talking about with advocacy, really creating space for informed choice and empowerment about how students want to proceed on their kind of therapeutic journey to process trauma, really collaborative approach, really framing systems as really normal, expected reactions to abnormal experiences, protective, not defective. And it's really about what's happened to survivors and not what's wrong with survivors. And so just really want to acknowledge that we hope, again, this is the approach that students who are engaging with mental health services and survivor services, this is really the framework that they're operating with. And because of that, there's a lot of flexibility. Counselors can provide some additional case management and really, again, can tailor the services for the student. So this is done through an access appointment, and this has been, again, kind of re-envisioned in the fall semester to be able to provide more responsive services to survivors. As you heard from Dr. Walsh, there's still, is more demand. And so we know that we need additional, support to be able to be really timely and responsive to survivors' needs around mental health services. And these shifts have been really helpful in having students at least have this access appointment within a couple of weeks in reaching out to mental health services. And then from that access appointment, it's really helping students identify what services are going to be the best fit for them. Group counseling, individual counseling, and other services that might be available via referral. So there's, I think, at least one drop-in group counseling appointment left this semester, and then there will be further group counseling services available in the spring semester, as well as hopefully more openings for our individual counseling services in the spring semester as well. And so obviously, if a student's connected through our advocates, we can make that referral to mental health services. But students who are sure that they really want to connect with mental health specifically, they can call the general UHS line again, but select option 2. And then last, I'll talk about, but not least, I'll talk about our medical services at UHS that are part of survivor services. And so this is a range of confidential medical services for students affected by sexual assault and relationship violence that can include treatment of injuries, provide access to emergency contraception, pregnancy testing, HIV testing, and counseling, and screening and treatment of other STIs. This is the group that helps facilitate the forensic nurse exams at UHS that you heard from Dr. Walsh, and you heard a little bit about what this looks like. You'll also hear from Allie about kind of what forensic nurse exams look like more comprehensively in a little bit. But I did want to mention again that this service is now available during regular business hours at UHS at no cost to the student. And so a way to directly connect with our medical services at UHS Survivor Services, there are a variety of options. So one way is to make an appointment with the 6th Floor Blue Clinic. This is via the My UHS app or by calling the general UHS line and selecting option 1. You can also speak to a nurse directly about options following a sexual assault. And this is a phone line that is answered during regular business hours by a nurse, and students can remain anonymous if they just want to ask some questions about what medical services would look like. And students can also drop into the 6th Floor Blue Clinic during regular clinic hours. So again, lots of different options, but want to make different entry points really accessible for students. So that was a lot of different entry points again, and really important to just, if anything, remember a good kind of first point of contact is our general email, survivorservices@uhs.wis.edu, or our general UHS line, option 3. And again, the other options if you want to directly schedule with medical services, mental health, or an advocate via Starfish. So hopefully that was helpful. Just kind of overview about our sort of re-envisioned, newly integrated survivor services at UHS. And again, hope the takeaway is there are a really good group of folks that are here and available to support you in your different needs that you might have as a survivor, and to really encourage folks to have this information, share this information, and get connected with us if needed. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Molly. We're going to move to our third speaker of the night, who is Ali Schlotz. Ali currently serves as the supervisor of the Forensic Nurse Examiner program at Unity Point Health Meriter Hospital here in Madison. She is a BS in nursing and is SANE certified. She maintains 21 years of dedicated healthcare experience in a variety of settings, such as residential healthcare, psychiatry, and forensic nursing. Now let's welcome Ali.
Good evening, everyone. All right. Try to do this correctly. My name is Allie, she, her pronouns. And as we've talked about, I'm the Forensic Nurse Examiner Supervisor. I also practice at Meriter, which is on Park Street. It's not real far off campus, but we've really been excited to work with UHS and Kate and Molly and the whole group has been fantastic in finding, ways that we can better improve our services and support to survivors and work through some of the barriers that may prevent survivors from coming to us if UHS isn't available. So I'm going to talk to you about our services, maybe. Okay, here we go. This is just a disclosure language. Victims and perpetrators can be any gender or identify as any gender. I will do my best to use different varying languages and appropriate pronouns throughout the presentation. I will use the word victim, patient, survivors interchangeably. We work with law enforcement, and within the medical team, there's always different language between the practices. So our program has existed since 1988, and it's been part of the emergency department at Meriter. This past year, we served 475 survivors. And we saw quite a dip with COVID. A couple years prior, we had about 640 patients that we served. And we've seen kind of that decline since then. But it does seem as though our numbers are increasing again. And I think wouldn't believe that it's an increase of assault, more so just people coming in and reporting or wanting services. And as Kate had mentioned earlier, it is about 7% of our patient population, our students. And this has been pretty stable for at least over 3 years. So we're not seeing an increase, but we're not seeing a decrease in the student population. And this is just specific to UW. So we do see folks that are off-site, MATC, Edgewood. And our goal is to provide 24/7 services. That's always been our goal, just depending on our staffing and whether or not we're available. But generally speaking, we are here to support you. So we are out of the emergency department at Meriter, but we have traveled to the UW Hospital, Meriter Child and Adolescent Psych, St. Mary's, and UW TAC, which is the American Center, for folks that are inpatient. So we would travel for those needs. I'm going to kind of buzz through some of this stuff because I think it's really important. Kate and Molly brought up some points that were really helpful and stood out to me for future goals and barriers to address with the student population. So I'm a forensic nurse examiner. You may have also heard of sexual assault nurse examiners. They're fairly interchangeable. FNEs have a little more training in different types of physical injuries. So it's not all that much different. So we're fine if you adjust this as a SANE or an FNE. We see folks through the lifespan and folks that are experiencing sexual and physical assaults. individuals with intellectual disabilities. We also see suspects. We do our best to maintain the distance and timing of a victim within the hospital at the same time as a suspect. So if law enforcement is bringing in a suspect, we do request that they wait until our survivor victim leaves the building. So as I mentioned before, we see individuals for sexual assault, domestic violence, and strangulation. Some of this overlaps, so we may have an individual that comes in for a sexual assault that may also entail a strangulation or other physical assaults. But our higher population is those who have experienced sexual assaults. And very similar to UHS, we're able to provide STI prophylactics. So that would include also emergency contraception. We can assess, do a comprehensive head-to-toe examination, which we could assess your body just to make sure everything's okay and treat within our scope. If it is something beyond what we can do or are trained to do, we would involve one of our providers in the ER. We can determine if injuries are consistent with the history. So depending on what happened, we would be able to document this is consistent with the history that was provided by the victim. And in situations where an individual would like to report to law enforcement, that type of language could be really helpful in prosecution of a case if it gets to that point, if a survivor wants to go that route. We do evidence collection, and that includes photography, and we testify in court. We also connect individuals with advocacy and other resources in the community. And the way that I like to present this to folks is kind of an a la carte menu that when you come in, everything is driven by the survivor's choice. You can come in and just ask, you know what, I just want emergency contraception and that's all. And we may, talk with you, and if someone changes their mind, we could always do more, we can do less, but it's always driven by the survivor. So what we can do, some of this stuff is just may or may not be information that you're interested in, but we take this opportunity to educate folks, and especially if someone is reporting, we're often asked, well, can you tell if they were assaulted? So if, for example, if someone had been drinking, they blacked out, they may not remember, they might remember small pieces of what happened. We have survivors come in that I remember being with my friends at 11 o'clock last night. I woke up and I didn't have clothing on. I was in a different place and my genital area hurts. Can you tell me if I was assaulted? We can't tell you indefinitely, but what we can do is assess your body, and we can provide the prophylactics and also educate law enforcement and be able to assist you through the judicial process. So for example, law enforcement may ask something like, well, was their hymen intact? Was there injury? Well, wouldn't that tell you if they were assaulted? No, that wouldn't say. Highest percentage, most individuals that were assaulted, especially if there was a drug facilitated sexual assault, they don't have injury. So lack of injury does not mean there was consensual intercourse or any kind of sexual act. So it was interesting in Kate's data that referenced that people didn't feel like, they weren't injured, they didn't have injury, so they didn't go in, but most people don't. So that's where we can provide that education to explain that physiologically our bodies physiologically we are protected, and that is why we don't see injury most of the time. I'm just looking at some of the other points here. So these are the things that we would offer. Again, it's all by your choice. So you could have a full comprehensive exam, you can get photographs done, you can have us collect a history of what happened. We can do the prophylactics. We also can do an internal exam as far as in the genital area or anal area. So a speculum, which could look internally for injury. And an anoscope would be to look internally your anus, and we can also collect evidence from those areas if you decide. And we also provide discharge teachings and offer resources. And we will follow up with you usually within a week if you have questions or concerns. There's just a few stats. We talk a lot about risk with different STIs, also HIV. We'll discuss the risk benefit to, having taking the STI prophylactics versus not. Evidence collection windows. This gives folks an idea of how long we can, how far out you can go to get evidence collected if you're interested. So with adults, it's typically 120 hours, so that's 5 days. If there's an oral assault or concern for an oral assault, it's typically 24 hours. But again, if you are, say 124 hours outside of that window, I always encourage people to call and we'll talk it through, and the nurse it's up to our discretion if there might be a reason that we could collect further out. And then also we may ask to collect your clothing. And again, that's all your choice. If you are deciding to report, law enforcement may ask you for certain items of your belongings, and you have the right to refuse. You do not have to turn those pieces of clothing over for evidence. It can be helpful, but we can work through other options if you're not comfortable giving those pieces of clothing or your belongings away. Reporting options. I think this is an area where a barrier for where college students or underage students, meaning like underage drinking, the concerns around reporting. Whether you're using alcohol or illicit drugs, law enforcement does not, they don't care about that. They're not going to ticket you. They're not going to focus at all on your use, whether it's voluntary or not. They're interested in assisting you with the crime that happened, the assault that happened. But if you're an adult, which I would assume all of you are 18 or over, you have these different options. So you can report to law enforcement and have evidence collected. Now we can only collect evidence within that 120-hour window. You can report to law enforcement and not have evidence collected. You don't have to report to law enforcement, and there is an option to do what we call an undecided kit, which is where we can collect evidence, and the Wisconsin state statute for evidence preservation is 10 years. So you have up to 10 years to decide if you want to report the crime. We often encourage people to consider making that decision at about 9.5 years, just so law enforcement can process the kits and work on the investigation. And then you could come in and you don't have to report and you don't have to have evidence collected. So I think, I often wonder if people fear that they have to report, you don't. And if you are using illicit drugs or alcohol or both, that's going to be the focus. And it's not, I haven't experienced that, and the nurses I've worked with have not ever seen that happen. Generally speaking, we've had good relationships with our local law enforcement agencies. And also reporting to police or law enforcement is not the same as Title IX. So I think that'll be talked about a little bit more here later. So we do not reach out to Title IX. We don't reach out to the university. So with the undecided kits can only be for sexual assault. Unfortunately, they don't store the kits. For example, we do kits for like strangulation, or if there's skin to skin touch, we can attempt to collect evidence. So this kind of talks through how the process works as far as reporting in the evidence. So what's going to happen when you come in for an exam? So we are out of the emergency department, which can be daunting, I think. Going into the hospital, it would be wonderful if we were in a separate area, but we kind of work with what we have. You would come into the emergency department and check in. You would be triaged, which is generally doing your vitals and asking, they may ask for a brief description of why you come in. And you could tell them that you're here to see a SANE nurse or a forensic nurse examiner. If you're not comfortable giving any further history, you don't have to. You're always welcome to call. We have a direct line. You can leave a confidential message and we will return your call. And we can talk through the process. If you're really nervous or scared about coming in or have questions, you can call ahead. We typically don't schedule exams. It's first come, first serve. However, we have made some exceptions or just work through kind of have a plan together and how we can make that the process as less stressful as possible. We're going to see, we always contact an advocate for sexual assault. And we don't provide any of your personal identifiers until they present and have permission from you to be given, for us to give that information. And then we typically do our history collection, which is an interview. We do some health history. We talk about the incident, what happened, and the most important details that we need is to guide us as far as where to collect evidence if you decide you want evidence collection or if you have any injury. So we just talk through that process together. And then we'll do the discharge teaching and follow-up recommendations. If you do want to report, we will help with that process. We've kind of been creative with this in that if people want to report, but they're just not in the space to talk with law enforcement, we can initiate that first call either during your exam or towards the end of your exam and request that law enforcement follow-up maybe the next day. So that way you don't have to talk with them immediately. And we've had pretty good experience with that. The other option is to have them come in and there would be an advocate there if you chose to have an advocate, the forensic nurse examiner and law enforcement. And then the hope would be that you would just you would give your story one time instead of repeating it over and over and over. The exam time can be long, but again, it all depends on what you decide to do. It could be anywhere from 20 minutes to 6 hours. So if you're coming in and you just want to get STI prophylactics or emergency contraception, it could be 20, 30 minutes. If you want to do more of a comprehensive head to toe exam, photos, evidence collection, that could be a bit longer. And if there are injuries, anyone who's experienced physical assault or strangulation, injury, severe pain or bleeding would need to be assessed by one of our providers in the ER just to ensure that your body is safe. And as I mentioned a couple times, that you're not obligated to do any part of the exam. If you decide to get in the door and you're just not ready, you can leave and come back or not return. It's, whatever you want to do. I just wanted to touch a little bit. There's quite a few slides on drug facilitated sexual assault. I'm not sure if these are going to be posted for folks to, okay, great. But this was already talked about a bit. There's often alcohol involved on campus. There are other substances that are utilized for drug facilitated sexual assaults, and those are listed here, but alcohol is number one. as it's a 50% of assaults occur, under the influence if it's a drug facilitated sexual assault. And that's something that, when we are asking our questions, we ask about voluntary or involuntary use of alcohol and or drugs, because it affects your ability to consent and your functionality. So that's helpful for law enforcement, for us to know. There's things over the counter that I would have never imagined people utilizing for facilitated sexual assault, such as eye drops, sleep aids, antihistamines. And a lot of these substances leave your system within 6 hours. But that doesn't mean we won't try to test for them. We can always try to do that. So here you see GHB out of your system within 6 hours, 12 urine. If you are not reporting, we have some options that we can do, send out lab work. If it's more a peace of mind, knowing if there was a potential for a substance that was involved. If you are under the influence, you're always welcome to come in. We may have you just take a break, rest a little while, come back at a later time. It's very important that those who we are seeing are able to consent and assent through the entire process. So if we feel that you're not able to consent and assent through the process, we will wait until you're in a place where you can. It's so important for survivors to have that choice and control over the situation. We don't use like breathalyzer tests or those types of things to judge whether or not you can consent. It's more based on your mental and your cognitive responses. Billing and funding. So we like to say that you should never receive a bill for a sexual assault nurse exam. Now with students, this is a concern that comes up quite a bit, or individuals who have a abusive partner and carry the insurance. If you are on your family's insurance and you don't want them to know that you came in for an exam, please let the nurse know and we'll work with the billing department. Most of the time, insurance is billed first, and then we utilize crime victim compensation, which is funding to cover our exams or sexual assault forensic exams, safe funds. And those are for individuals who have been sexually assaulted and are not reporting. So we will work with you. We just don't like to say they're free because there's just some caveats and legal issues that we have to work around. But we have funds to cover that and you shouldn't get a bill. Thank you all so much. It was a pleasure being here. And as I mentioned, our number is here, our direct line. You can leave a confidential voicemail. If you don't want to give a lot of information or your full name, you don't have to. As I said, you're an adult. We are not mandatory reporters in these situations. If there's a few mandatory reporting requirements, which would be gunshot wounds. Gosh, there's like a few different ones, but we would let you know if you don't want to disclose your personal information, you can just call and ask questions. So yes, thank you so much. And hope you guys let us know. I don't know when to turn this off.
I know we're running a little bit behind tonight, guys. Thank you all so much for your patience. At this time, we are going to offer our 3 to 5 minute break. Please do not leave. We have 3 more presentations after our break. This is not the end of our programming. But for the next few minutes, you can stand up and stretch, go to the bathroom. There's water and restrooms on this floor. Please return to your seats if possible by 8:12. Thank you. That was a really fast 5 minutes, but that was amazingly 5 minutes. So here we go. We are going to get back going. Wafa, are we good? Wonderful. All right, so we're going to return to this evening's programming by welcoming Lauren Hasselbacher to the stage. Lauren currently serves as the Assistant Director of Civil Rights Compliance and University Title IX Coordinator. She oversees the Sexual Misconduct Resource and Response Program, which is responsible for the university response to sexual harassment and sexual violence. Lauren attended UW-Madison for her undergraduate degree and the University of Colorado for law school. At this time, join me in welcoming Lauren Hasselbacher.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking around and for having me. My name is Lauren. I use she, hers pronouns, and I am the University Title IX Coordinator. So when you've heard different programs and people reference reporting to the university or reporting to Title IX, that's the program that I oversee on campus. So we are now going by the Sexual Misconduct Resource and Response Program. It's somewhat of a name change, but realistically, we really didn't have a formal name before. So we did some surveying across campus and found that this was the most explanatory, intuitive title for what we do. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what it looks like when you get connected to our program. So similarly, while we're talking about sexual assault tonight, our program does respond to other types of sexual harassment and sexual violence on campus. So that includes dating and domestic violence, stalking, a new charge under a policy called sexual exploitation, and then related retaliation to those types of complaints. So we handle all of those within our program because, as referenced earlier, frequently there's overlap between those types of allegations and misconduct, and they can all come to us for response. So really broadly, we're responsible for the university's response to this type of misconduct. And so we take complaints and concerns from students, from employees, from visitors, from other affiliates, involving allegations against that same big group of people. And so centralizing that is really helpful because no matter kind of what group you belong to, and no matter who the allegation is against, it's all happening in one place, following similar procedures, similar process. So in addition to formal investigations, which people are maybe more familiar with, we also offer supportive and protective measures and informal resolutions. Currently, our staff includes myself as the coordinator. We have a case manager who is really the first contact for people when they get connected to us. We now have 3 full-time investigators, as well as a deputy coordinator for our youth programs. UW-Madison hosts a lot of minors and youth on campus and various programs, and so she's in charge of compliance in those areas. So we get reports directly from complainants. So that's the term our program uses for victims or survivors of sexual harassment, sexual violence. And we also get people connected through responsible employees. And those are mandatory reporters that work in various positions across campus. So since July 1st, so far this academic year, we've had approximately 220 individual reports to our program. So again, that's from students and employees over the full scope of misconduct that we address. But that does include about 100 reports of sexual assault involving a student. So that's just this semester. Those numbers are definitely higher than usual, but we're making some assumptions that it reps in people who maybe didn't report last year when we weren't as physically on campus because numbers were lower last year. So generally speaking, no matter if you come to us directly yourself, whether a responsible employee connected you, maybe you were referred from confidential services on campus, that first point of contact is going to look pretty similar regardless. And it's just going to be an initial email contact from our case manager. It will include a copy of the Sexual Misconduct Resource and Response Guide. And I'll show you a little bit of what that looks like on the next slide, but it's also a lot of the same content that's in your handout that you picked up today, or that's included with the presentation. We'll also offer protective measures, academic accommodations, and referrals to confidential resources in the community and at the university. Always, it's the complainant's decision about whether they want to respond. and whether they want to pursue any of those resources, if they want to pursue a formal investigation. Our main goal at that first contact is just to make sure people have access to the information and know what's available to them. So this is just a few pages out of our campus resource guide, the table of contents. We haven't been printing it, but it's available as electronic PDF on our website, and it's hyperlinked throughout. So if you're trying to get to specific information quickly, get referred to other programs, we tried to make this as easy to operate as possible. But you can find this on our website, and a lot of the same information is repeated there. So I've mentioned protective measures a few times, and that could look very different depending on what the circumstances are for any particular person. Commonly, we issue no contact directives. So it's an administrative letter from our program to a student or an employee or someone else affiliated with the university, telling them they can no longer have contact with the complainant. This is not disciplinary. There's a very low bar for having this no contact directive issued. We just have to know that there's been some allegation of sexual harassment or sexual violence. No investigation is necessary. We use this as a preventative measure to prevent any future harassment, contact, retaliation from occurring. Similar with exclusions or bans, we might be able to keep people from certain spaces, like a dining hall that you use frequently, a student club that you're part of, your residence hall if the respondent has no basis for being there. So again, it's to protect the person, it's to make a complainant feel safe in their space without having to worry about encountering the accused student or employee. And then finally, we'll also get you connected if you are looking for it to the vocal restraining order clinic or other resources if you're looking for a civil restraining order. So those first options are from the university. They're enforced through our office. A civil restraining order is enforced by law enforcement and potentially by the district attorney's office for violations. So we happen to have this great clinic through our law school that helps people get representation through our law students if you wanted to pursue a civil restraining order through the courts. Accommodations also can look different depending on the circumstances and what somebody's looking for to feel better or to feel safer. So for housing, that might mean that the complainant no longer wants to be in a place they don't feel safe or as triggering memories for them, and they ask to move to a different space. We're always happy to do that. We may also be able to move the respondent out of a space if we assess that there's any sort of ongoing risk or potential for ongoing harassment or contacts from that person. And again, this looks different about whether people feel, we have people say they feel more safe in the lakeshore because it's quieter, it's more isolated. We have people say they feel much safer in Celery or Woody because there's lots of people around and it's busier. So it varies from person to person, and we do our best to accommodate them based on what's available within housing. Academic accommodations start usually with a letter or a connection to somebody's instructor, letting them know they might need more flexible deadlines, they might need some excused absences, they may need to be put in a different working group than they were in before because they don't want to be with the respondent. Again, we'll work with everyone involved to make sure we're trying to meet those needs as they come up. And then similar with workplace accommodations, it might be different locations, different shifts, different reporting lines to make sure someone feels safe in their workspace. So again, this is all on our office. I didn't mention the Sexual Misconduct Resource and Response Program is through the Office of Compliance. So all of this information is on our website. On the right bar, you'll see student support information, and that's where you'll get most of this. And then finally, I want to quickly just talk about resolution options, and that's when there's some intervention with the respondent. So we frequently conduct alternative resolutions, which is an option for somebody not wanting to pursue a formal investigation for whatever reason, or in situations where maybe the behavior alleged isn't quite at the level of a policy violation, but it's looking concerning, it's escalating, and we want to be able to try to put a stop to it before it gets to that point. So that's really a conversation with the respondent, a review of our policy. It might come along with a no contact directive or other accommodations, but we're not making any conclusions or factual findings in those cases. Again, we're trying to prevent future misconduct from happening. And then finally, there's formal investigations, which are a much more rigid process that involves interviews, gathering evidence, making formal conclusions about responsibility. That can sometimes involve a hearing. It depends a little bit on the parties and how the process moves forward. In this case, we're serving as neutral investigators, our staff, who are investigators. They're not advocating for one side or the other. They're really a neutral party, trying to gather as much relevant information as possible. But both parties have a right to have someone there with them. So that's when we refer to victim advocacy services. They can bring a friend, they can bring an attorney if they like, and really make sure that the people involved understand our role, as well as the role of a potential advisor or advocate in that process. And then I just want to address really quickly kind of when we might conduct a formal investigation, because there might be some assumption that any contact to our office results in a formal investigation, which is not true. Or on the other end of the spectrum, people assume that the university is trying to avoid or dissuade people from formal investigations. And I can also say that that's not true. In reality, what happens is that, like I said, if we take those 220 contacts that we got so far this semester, I think we're conducting about 8 to 9 formal investigations at the moment. And that's because the complainant requested that of us. And so just like survivor services, we really try to rely on the self-empowerment mode, allow people to choose that for themselves. There are some exceptions where there's a safety risk to campus and we need to move forward regardless. But even in those cases, we're going to work with the complainant, safety plan with them, make sure those protective measures are in place before we do that. And so, people choose to investigate or move forward with that process for a variety of reasons. Same, they may choose not to. What we also see is that sometimes people come to us and get those initial protective measures, academic accommodations, come back a few months later and decide that they want to pursue the formal investigation when they're feeling a little safer and more secure. Okay, I think that's all I have. This is our contact information. To get in touch, you're welcome to contact me directly, but there's also an online reporting form on our website if you or someone needs to report any type of misconduct. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate your participation tonight. Thank you for joining us. We are now going to invite Natalie. Forgive me if I forgot to pronounce your last name, DeMoriabis. Close, kind of? Close. Okay, that's fine. And Marisol Rubio, who may or may not be here, to the stage. We are very fortunate to have Natalie with us tonight, and they're going to be providing us with a short demonstration on self-defense that can be used in sexual situations. Natalie is the lead instructor for Chimera Self-Defense, which is part of the Rape Crisis Center and Wisconsin's only empowerment self-defense program. Chimera teaches violent and nonviolent techniques in a trauma-informed setting to women and non-binary students, ages 12 and up. At this time, please join me in welcoming Natalie to the stage. Okay, yes, thank you. Very excited to be here. My last name is pronounced DeMoriabis and no one gets it right, so no worries. I actually sent an email being like, here's how you pronounce chimera, and totally forgot that I have an unpronounceable last name, so whatever, it's fine. Okay, so before I get into the meat of what I really wanted to talk about, I want to make sure that I put up Marisol's name. Marisol couldn't make it tonight, but they are our UW advocate and they have a satellite office on campus. So if you think you might like to talk to them about advocacy or emotional support, or if you want to know what they can help you with or anything, please call one of our helplines and we'll be able to tell you, we'll be able to get that set up for you. We offer emotional support, all kinds of advocacy trainings and presentations, and Chimera self-defense classes. So bring me in. I'm excited. I love doing these classes. So and the other thing I wanted to talk about before we got rolling was, I don't know if there might've been people who saw that there was self-defense on tonight and were kind of like, oh, I don't know about that. That seems
That doesn't seem right. Self-defense is victim blaming. It's bad. And that's like, it's kind of a fair reaction for like bad self-defense. And people who teach empowerment self-defense are really trying to make a big push that everyone understands that there's self-defense that is not like a male martial artist or a police officer like giving like this boot campy speech about like if you're stupid enough to be walking after sunset by yourself, which also, you know what time the sun sets now, right? So like, thank you for that. That's the bad kind of self-defense. And empowerment self-defense is taught by people who understand, they understand violence, they understand like gender dynamics, violent dynamics. These are just some of the ways that that empowerment self-defense is different from traditional self-defense. So a lot of bad self-defense classes like will tell you how to like, they tell you why you should be afraid and how you should change your life, right? So that you don't ever face danger, which is stupid anyway, because you can't predict the future. And we say, okay, tell me your life. That's great. You live your life. Let's figure out how to help you be confident. Where are you afraid? How can we help you deal with that fear? How can we give you tools to deal with your actual life? Because like, it's safer to stay at home, but like, what if you're not a plant, right? And like you have a life. So we really stick to facts and statistics, and we teach way more than just physical skills. We do teach physical skills because they're great. They're not all violent techniques. They're non-violent physical stuff that I hope we'll have time to get to tonight. All kinds of, we do a ton of work with assertiveness, how violence unfolds, the psychology of violence, what are the best ways to interrupt it, and so forth. So really, really broad. We want to give you as broad a range of options as we possibly can. Okay, so this is from, I had a student who said that she was at a bar and a strange person who she did not know and had never seen before forced her to eat a piece of his pizza. Like, which I sort of love as an example because it's not a sexual assault situation, but it's an exercise of that same kind of power, right? That is what sexual assault is usually kind of about. So this is an exercise. These are designed to be like two-person role plays, and we're a little sparse in person, but I'm gonna give it a shot anyway. So if you have someone next to you, we're gonna take turns. Just one of you is gonna be the aggressor, and you're gonna try to get the other person to have some of your pizza. And if you are the defender, this is your line, okay? Just say this. Do not apologize. Do not explain that you just ate and that you're not hungry, right? You just say, I don't want any pizza. And you don't get points for being creative, right? Just say the same thing over and over until they give up. And it's not gonna take very long because it's really boring to have that conversation when someone's just saying the same thing. So why don't we give that a shot with our sparse audience? But that's great, that's great. Everyone is very nicely spread out in like Midwestern personal bubbles, which I respect. But find somebody, try to get them to eat a piece of your pizza. Just for a minute, give it a shot. Okay, switch. Have the other person try to get them to have pizza. Switch. All right. Okay, good. Thank you for participating. I appreciate that. So if this were more of a, if we had more time, I would do like a full debrief with everybody and see like how that felt. Since we don't have a ton of time, everyone, can you just give me like this was like, that was so easy. I'm insulted you made me do that. And this is like, wow, that was way harder than I thought it would be. That was really weird. And you can be anywhere in between. Just show me how that was for you. I see, okay, couple thumbs, that's awesome. Everyone, a lot of people were in the middle. So this is not an exercise like, has it ever occurred to you to say no? Like, that's not what I'm going for. This is like a self-discovery tool, right? Some people do this, they think it's gonna be really hard and it was super easy, or the other way around, right? And it's all about learning what what's your Achilles heel. A lot of people I find, especially white women from the Midwest, tend to conflate saying yes with being nice and saying no with being mean. And that's just something like, if that's what you grew up thinking, it's not that you necessarily need to totally change your way of thinking about everything. Just the more you're aware of something like that, right? The more you can be aware when someone is trying to use that to manipulate you. So we do a ton of things that are like this, usually a little more involved. But it's always an interesting, was it interesting for people? Raise your hand if you were like, huh, fascinating. Kind of, yeah, good, okay, awesome, thank you. All right, and the second thing that I want to show you is, thank you for that, hug defenses. So this is something like, and before I get into this, I might understand if you are frustrated that there isn't more like physical violence in my presentation. And I hear that because it is fun to hit stuff and it does make you feel powerful when you feel like you can do it well. But the physical techniques that we teach tend to be really, really easy. So like we teach a palm heel strike, which is awesome. It's super powerful. It's really fun. You take this part of your hand and you smash it into somebody's face. So like I just taught you how to do it. It's not hard. You are going to be able to do it like decently now that I just said that. But a lot of us find that we are unprepared for situations like these, right? The ones where someone is like, hey, eat my pizza. And you're like, that's so weird. I don't even know what to say to that. Or when someone is coming in for a hug and you're like, no, but like, you don't know what to do about it. So hug defenses are one of my favorite things. So what you do is you make a heart shape with your hands. So like that, okay? And what that does is it eventually you run into their arms, right? As they're coming at you with a hug. Eventually you run into them, you scoop their hands together, kind of and keep them between you. And then you kind of pretend like that was a normal interaction and you move on with the conversation really fast. Like you scoop it together and you're probably gonna get like, oh, what's your problem? Oh, what's wrong? What, right? Because people don't do that very often. And what you do is you say, oh, I didn't feel like a hug, but it's really good to see you. How are your kids? How are your finals going? How are you, right? And you move on and people tend to go along. If you're like, this is a totally normal situation, people are like, I guess. And it all turns out okay. So, does anyone, let's see, anyone willing to run up here real quick and let me turn down a hug? So that, yeah, I don't make you do it before I, yes, awesome, thank you, Micah. Let's see. All right. Good to see you. Good to see you. Okay. It's literally that awkward. It's fine. Thank you for the couple of clappers in the back. All you just, I mean, it's actually, it boils down to kind of a common sense thing where you just, you interrupt whatever they're doing. So it's the same thing if someone is trying to put their arm around your shoulders, then you just like, if their hand is right here and they're over here, you just pick up their hand and you kind of lift it off. If someone is coming up behind you, they're trying to like slip their arm around your waist or something, and you can just kind of like push their arm away. Like, it's not how we, like the whole point, if we don't want the touch, we don't want to touch the person, right? But if you take a little bit of initiative and you can interrupt, you can be like, that arm doesn't go there. That hand doesn't belong on my knee. And then you avoid the worst touching that you were really dreading. Does that make sense? So find a partner near you and try to give them a hug. And I know that's a step up from the pizza thing. But give it a shot. See how that feels. It's a little awkward. It's just awkward. That's no, yeah. So we have a so thank you for those of you who are participating. I saw a couple of things that I enjoyed. Over here, I saw a handshake, like a handshake instead of a hug, I think was what I was seeing, which is totally legitimate. And one of my fellow instructors has a story about like she was working retail and a customer would come in and always give her a hug and she didn't like it. So he came in one time and she was like, "Hi, how about a handshake?" And like stuck her hand out in front of her like a like a sword or something. And he was like, "Oh, okay." And it just shifted and it was fine. And then we have a question about height differences and how like if someone is hugging you and you can't reach them until they're like right up in your face. And you might just have to be creative. I think people sometimes ask me how to deal with hugs that are going on too long. And I think it depends on who's hugging you. A lot of times they're just not ready for you to just push, you know, like you're just like, "Oh, hey." Or some people will say something like, "That's long enough," right? Or "This is going on for a while," or something, right? Because if it's a friendly hug, this isn't someone who's trying to like grab you super tight and hold on, you know? So if you miss them, I guess is what I've got. If they come in anyway and you're like, "Oh no, I didn't get it in time," then just like push on them and be like, "Hey, too much, too long. I like, oh, let go of me," right? Take your blurb of choice and tell them no. Let's see. Trying to think what else I have on that, because those are tricky. But anyway, those were my two sort of pet exhibits for you to try out. So thank you for participating, and I will be around to answer questions afterwards if you want to hear more. And thank you.
All right, guys, we made it. We are at our last presenting group of the evening. We are going to welcome the members of the PAVE UW delegation to the stage. PAVE stands for Promoting Awareness, Victim Empowerment. They're an RSO on the UW-Madison campus, and they served as an integral collaborator on this event, and we are grateful to them for their support and participation tonight. At this time, please welcome Talia Eisemann and Nimazia, oh, excuse me, I just burped. I'm so sorry. Nimazia Funkum to the stage.
Okay. Hi, everyone. We are PAVE. I'm Talia. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the outreach coordinator.
My name is Edamazia. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the special projects coordinator. Yeah.
Okay. We are PAVE, which stands for Promoting Awareness, Victim Empowerment. And we are a student organization dedicated to preventing sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and stalking through education and activism. So many people think of sexual violence as only impacting survivors, but it impacts everyone in this room by affecting communities that we're a part of. And so since it affects all of us, we can all play a role in ending gender-based violence. Yeah.
So sorry, there's a frog in my throat. Something that informs us in our activism and our work at PAVE UW is thinking of anti-violence work as anti-oppression work, because the way that violence affects us is very dependent on our individual demographics, and the ways in which our communities are affected by violence differs by what communities we are a part of. So as allies of different communities and as members of the communities we're a part of, it is crucial and integral to educate ourselves about how to support survivors with different identities. And we have to think about the fact that patriarchy, rape culture, and other systems of oppression need to be dismantled in order to eliminate violence of all kinds.
All right, and then I forgot to mention this, but we do our work through workshops for student orgs and classes. And then we also do events, especially for awareness months, and then also volunteer opportunities for some of our members. And then something new that we started doing this semester is having PAVE support spaces in our office, since we're able to be in our office more, kind of in that post-COVID era. And so we're having the support spaces Mondays and Friday afternoons. And at these times, we do self-care activities, processing time to be in the community with people who support and uplift survivors. And we do have people from the UHS team. And I think the survivor advocate, Anna, and other people would join us at those times.
We also got dogs one time, so that was cool too. A big project that we're working on right now, and Dr. Kate Walsh shared some of those quotes, is talking about what it really means to be a survivor at UW-Madison and what that experience means to students and how we can influence and impact a greater experience at our campus. Right now, we have a petition to fund survivor services up. We've gotten, I believe, 500 signatures in 6 days. So, I mean, people care. You'd think they would. You don't see all of them right here, but they do care. But we're hoping that everyone can share this petition and start to think a little bit more about the ways that our survivor services can continue to advocate for those people who are here on campus and need that support.
All right. Yeah, so if you have any questions, we'll be around to answer those. And then the barcode has all of the information that I think goes to our link tree, and that has more information about us there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Talia and Damazia for joining us tonight. We really appreciate PAVE's support at our event. Before we move on to what was supposed to be the Q&A time, I'm going to make sure that it is aware for everyone who is here tonight that we've had several safe walkers volunteer their time to assist anyone who wishes to be accompanied home on their walk tonight. If you are a safe walker here to assist guests with getting home safely, please stand or raise your hands very quickly so that you can be spotted. We've got some in that corner, we've got some in that corner in the orange jackets. If you would like to be accompanied home tonight, please connect with one of the Safe Walker team members after the event. We were originally going to have a Q&A at this time. I believe we have minus 2 minutes to do that. And so what I am going to ask, hopefully it's not an inconvenience, is maybe a 5-minute question and answer period for prioritized questions. If I could invite the speakers participating in the Q&A to come to the stage at this time. For anyone interested in asking a question to our speakers, please form a line behind the microphones. Again, do this kind of quickly. We want to be courteous of their time. Please form a line at the microphones here at the front of the room. We're going to alternate microphone by microphone until all questions are answered or until we run out of time. And yes, please do that now. I do have a question for you guys. I'll start. Thank you so much. I hope. Yeah. So I guess my question is directed at Molly because that's where I thought of it. I know that UHS has been having some issues with staffing related to counseling services on campus, i.e. there's more students that need counselors than there are counselors available. And I'm wondering if you experience this barrier with students who are seeking survivor services, and if not, why not do you think that? And now it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so definitely, historically, this has been a concern on our campus, to really have adequate staffing for mental health services, advocacy services at UHS and in the community. It's when I talked about the sort of re-envisioning of a more integrated care system and some of the adjustments to our services, that was really an attempt to try to address some of that. And I think that has done a lot this semester. And there's still, by the end of the semester, still is a call list for students for mental health services in particular that, extends into the spring semester. So it's, even with some of those changes, creative ways to address staffing issues, that's still an issue. And so again, hoping to continue to think about those different ways we can get students connected to advocacy services in the community, group counseling options that are available, as well as address the needs for individual counseling. So definitely still a concern, and appreciate the activism of students to think about what additional resources could look like.
Thank you so much.
Hello, hi. I have a question. This might not be touched too in depth in any of the presentations because it's kind of a bit far into the topic of sexual assault and the ranges of violence that could happen. But based on my observation and conversations with a lot of people that I have, a common form of sexual assault, particularly rape, that happens to a lot of people are not reported because it's intimate partner violence, and it involves strong long-term relationships with people, and a lot of these are take the form of violence that is it started initially as as consensual sex, but then the consent was, what's the word for it, removed mid-sex, and it wasn't understood by the partner, or for whatever reason. And what advice would you kind of provide, or what can you share for these kind of people who are afraid to come forward because reporting and talking about it would affect your relationships or the person that they love? What would you say about that? Thank you.
I'm happy to provide one response to that, but thank you for raising that. I think you're highlighting a complexity that is there and is a reality for a lot of folks. And what you were describing too also fits with some of the data that we saw in the SHIFT study that I described earlier, where a lot of the sexual violence that was happening in that context was not reported. And I think that there is a lot, you want to maintain a relationship. There might be some shame about, coming forward and talking about this. I also feel like there's a lot around consent too, where there are ideas that, if you gave consent one time, then, maybe you'd be more willing to engage in the same behavior again. And so certainly relationship precedence has been found to be a factor in some of these kinds of assaults. And I think that, there's a lot that we could really think about in terms of what healthy relationships might look like. And they can look very different for different people and for different couples. And I think that there could be a more significant focus on how to help people navigate that within their relationship relationships and for themselves to kind of figure out what are they comfortable with? How do you use some of the verbal tactics perhaps that Chimera was talking about to really express yourself and what you want. And so both partners are getting what they want out of that situation. But in terms of the reporting, I do think you're right that we could probably do more to encourage folks to come forward and get help around that form of violence in particular. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I will just mention, of course, the support resources and confidential resources are available to anyone in that position. But also from a university reporting compliance perspective, our policy does take into consideration those types of situations. Front consent has to be freely given. It has to be given for the specific sexual activity in question. Federal law and our policy prohibits, using the complainant's previous sexual history against them. So our investigators who are making those types of decisions and conducting those investigations also have training on the dynamics of intimate partner violence, on sexual assault and trauma that comes with it. And so even beyond the support counseling services that are available, those types of considerations are understood with the actual compliance and response piece as well.
Anyone else have a question that they would like to ask?
Hi, I had a question for Molly and Allie more. So I was just wondering, for when people go in to counseling and to the ER, is their care followed up with consistent providers after that, or consistent nurses, or is it kind of just more of a one-stop shop thing?
So that's an excellent question. So one of the things that, so when you come to the ER, generally speaking, we provide our services as forensic nurses. We will provide access to resources and can make recommendations. We don't make referrals in the sense of, like a medical provider can. But we can connect with our ED providers. One of the things that we've really increased and utilized is our care coordinator in our emergency departments. She's done a great job following up with patients who've requested additional services. Like one example could be mental health services, to be connected with a mental health provider in the community. And that would be off campus. We can also work with UHS, to see if there's availability on campus. Even if it's, you want a primary care provider here in the area, if you're not from the area, we can help with that. That's an area that is a goal for us to have more access and follow through. Now we do connect with you. We always follow up calls with our patients unless they prefer not. But after that, unless we have calls and have, if patients have questions, we don't do anything much more beyond that. But we're definitely, when you come in initially, we'll help you access some of those resources, and advocacy is awesome too with that as well.
Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say at UHS, we have the benefit of being, more integrated with advocacy, mental health, and medical services. Our medical services team would, be connected with that student right away and could continue to follow up, and also can make referrals to our mental health and advocacy team, which happens frequently. So we do have that benefit.
Right.
We still take the student's lead. They may prefer to connect with one provider or another, but we are able to provide more of that wraparound care if that's something that a student would like to do.
Right. Okay. And then I also had a question that's more clinical, I guess. I was just wondering, for trans folks and for people who are trans masculine and trans feminine, but like more trans masculine who are on testosterone, I was wondering if like the prophylactic contraception or like STI treatment, if that was different.
Now, are you asking about all the STI prophylactic or like emergency contraception?
Or I guess more contraception. I just know that like testosterone decreases the likelihood anyway. I don't know if like you would do anything different.
So what I would say is, and I think all of us in our practice, it's going to be very individualized because people may be in different processes of their transition. And as far as, what we do is anyone who has a uterus and there's a possibility of pregnancy, we will generally do a pregnancy test. And that's not too, that's a very medical standpoint. And I would say as far as, with the prophylactic treatment and emergency contraception, we would talk with the medical providers and just to, and have it very individualized, but respect the wishes. Everything is the choice of the victim or the survivor. So we would want to make sure that we're respecting their wishes and their process. I don't know if that answers. That's
Oh,
a
yeah, makes
really good question
Thank
because I
you.
think we want to improve our services in that population.
So we want to make sure we're being courteous to the time of our safe walkers who have volunteered their time tonight and also to our guest speakers. So we're going to conclude the Q&A. If you have personal questions for our speakers or any of our other organizational collaborators tonight, please direct them individually. We are going to say goodnight now. Thank you so much to coming to our Confronting Sexual Assault on UW-Madison campus. Thank you to the guest speakers, Dr. Walsh, Molly, Allie, Lauren, Natalie, Safewalk, PAVE, and the Wisconsin Union. Thank you all for offering your time and your resources. And that is the conclusion of our program. Everyone, please get home safely and have a good night. Thank you.
Yeah, I was curious.